at Force Design, and I'm excited to be your host and your moderator for this session today. I am pleased to introduce, sitting beside me is Stephen Lehman. Stephen Lehman is one of our applications engineer, and what he's going to do for us today is help us walk through our ROI calculator and clear up any questions that you guys might have. Before he does that, I'd like to do a little housekeeping things for this presentation. First of all, the webinar is going to be on demand for your viewing purposes after this live session today. And how we're going to handle that is we'll send out a link and an email 24 hours after the webinar, today's session for this webinar. Hopefully you have received an email before this webinar with an ROI calculator as an attachment. And there it is. You can do with it what you choose. You can either open it up and follow along today with the presentation. And if you have a project in mind or a future project, current project, you can be filling it out as Stephen walks us through this. So another thing is, what we'd like to do is we'd like to hear your feedback here and maybe get questions from you as we go through. So there's going to be a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. You can enter in a question, and the way we'll handle that is that at the end of the presentation, Stephen and I will try to address some of the questions. We might not be able to get through all of them, but we'll do our best to try to answer quite a few of them. So, and lastly, we encourage you to send out links to and share this webinar with some of your social network that you guys have on your own. So lastly, I would like to kick things off by welcoming Stephen Lehman, our applications engineer, and I'm going to turn it over to him at this time as he can start walking us through this presentation and walking us through the ROI calculator.
Thank you, Jason. Well, thank you for taking a part of your day to spend with us. Hopefully, when we get all done, you'll feel like it was worth it. First thing I'd like to do is just talk about where we're going to go today. First and foremost, we'll talk just a little bit about the state of manufacturing, talk about automation in general. And then the heart of what we're trying to do is we'll demonstrate our ROI spreadsheet for you. We'd like to do that with an actual project that we did a couple years back. And then we'll have a second example that we'll walk through, one that's a common scenario that we see. And then, like Jason said, we'll follow up with Q&A. So if you have any questions or questions come to mind as we're working through this, please just go ahead and get those sent to us, and we'll try to address those at the end. So things have been kind of crazy here lately, right? We've been attending more webinars than normal, and everybody out there is learning how to use these softwares to do online meetings, that sort of thing. But really for us, you know, here at Force, we spend quite a bit of time kind of watching manufacturing and where trends are going and that sort of thing. And it's for this upheaval lately for us is just kind of highlighted really how important automation is in manufacturing. And there are so many places that we can automate that make a lot of sense. It's practical, it's a wise investment. And I hope until we're done today, you kind of see that. You kind of have a better understanding of why that's the case. One thing we've noticed, though, in dealing with clients from a variety of industries is that there's a lot of confusion about automation equipment or the purchase of automation equipment. And we'll try to clear that up as well. We view automated solutions really as an investment. When a manufacturer carefully applies automation, it eventually will make his company more profitable and also reduce the day-to-day stress of just making production. But what we see with our clients a lot of times is they too often view automated equipment almost like most of us view purchasing an automobile. You have that upfront cost, you drive it off the lot, and immediately it goes down in value. And the reality is, and I think you'll see this as we work through this today, automation is really more akin to a real estate purchase. There is an upfront cost, but there is a real return on it. And with automation, that return is actually quite a bit quicker. So the tool that we're going to talk about today is a spreadsheet that one of our engineers developed, and it's set up for you to put information into it, and you can tweak the numbers real easily, and it will give you some idea of how much more money you can be making if you automate a process, or if that process is even a good one to automate. But one of the things we run into when we discuss applications with our clients is helping them understand what their true costs are for doing a process manually. And we find that there's some lack of understanding there that we'd like to address as well. One thing I will say about this sheet we're going to look at, the quality of the data that you put into it directly affects the quality of the profit estimation. So I would encourage you in that regard. If you have good data, that will certainly help. So let's talk about here some of the costs associated with automation. So there's the obvious stuff that we think about when we think about operator cost, operator benefits. One thing we see in some applications is personal protection equipment. We looked at an application just the other day that annual cost for personal protection equipment was, I think, right around $10,000 for the operators in this particular process. So that can be a pretty big one. One thing that companies often don't think about is their recruiting cost and training cost. When they have people coming and going and they're trying to keep their operators trained, there's a cost associated with that, HR cost. In some applications we look at, there's a lot of costs due to injury, and that's significant. The same application that had the high PPE costs, their figured cost annually was around $34,000 a year for injury. But one of the areas we see that's a little less obvious is the lack of process control that you have with a manual process. So this tends to lead to greater scrap. It's harder to rein things in because it's a manual process. You don't have a great degree of repeatability. And also then, because the process is manual, you don't really have a way to glean metrics from that process so that you can improve the process and increase your profitability. So these are all kind of, these last ones here are really all kind of hidden cost, I would say. And what we try to do with this spreadsheet is isolate some of those costs, figure out what they are, and make sure we add them into our total understanding of our investment. It seems like most of the facilities that we go into have what we refer to kind of generically as just low-hanging fruit. These are projects that would be relatively simple to automate with very little risk. And that's one way this ROI tool is really handy, is you can kind of figure out what those projects are in your facility. And we'd certainly recommend you start there. You'll see an increased cash flow from doing those projects first. That'll allow you to operate larger and more complicated projects. So that's one of the ways to use it. We're going to get into the spreadsheet here in just a second, but one of the things I wanted to point out, make sure you understand, and if you have the spreadsheet and you messed with it a little bit, it is a protected spreadsheet, but it doesn't have a password on it. So you're welcome to unprotect the worksheet just like you would any Excel spreadsheet, and then you can tweak some of the numbers and the formulas to match your actual company. The first page in the spreadsheet, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it today, but it's really just some tools to analyze what projects to look at for automation. And one other thing I just want you to notice, and we'll point this out as we go through it, but you don't have to fill in every box on the spreadsheet. There's some boxes you do for sure, but there's some places that if you don't have all the information or if you don't have good metrics for it, you can leave it blank and it'll still give you an idea of what your return on the investment is going to be. So what we're going to do today to demonstrate this is we're going to look at a project that we did a couple years back, and the unit you see on your left is a ultrasonic welder. And the way this worked manually is an operator would take the parts, and the parts, that little round part there, looks like it's kind of like got a wafer in it. They would take the part, put it in the ultrasonic welder. The welder would do its work, and then the operator would remove the part. So the customer asked us to come in and look at this process and see if we could automate it. And in the course of time, they were actually going to ramp up production. So they needed to produce more parts than they were manually. So what we did is we put together this system. On the right, you see some custom design trays. These trays by design, they clock the parts in the tray so that the robot, this is a UR5 collaborative.
Correct. UR5.
UR5 collaborative that we used for this. Comes in, takes the parts out of the tray, places them in the ultrasonic welder, and then the UR5 goes back and gets the next part. The ultrasonic welder does its work, and then there's an automatic ejection system there where we eject the parts on the conveyor that you see there and run the parts out back under the UR5. So this is the project we're going to talk about today and illustrate the ROI calculator using that project. So if you've got the sheet, I'm going to back out just a little bit so we can see the entire thing. The first page on your left is where we put data in, and you see the colored tables at the top. That's where all the data goes. There's some guidance information in the bottom, in the text at the bottom of that page. And then the page on your right that has the graph at the top and the table beneath, that is all just to demonstrate profit over time. And we'll talk about that and show that as we go. But for now, we're going to zoom in and kind of look at each section on the first page. So the boxes on your left, the left side of the page that have the two tables that have blue labels, this is where we put in the values that we have for cost for automation. So an example here would be if you've gotten a quote or a proposal from an automation integrator, you can plug that right into the total system cost up here at the upper left. And then that's really all you need to do in that table. The entries below that, the system engineering, robot, end of arm tool, that is something we've built into this table for our own budgetary purposes. If we're looking at a system and we're trying to get a quick idea of what a system will cost, we'll put in each one of these categories separately, and that'll actually total it up for us. But if you're just putting a system cost in, you can put it in at the top and be done. So in our application that we're talking about, like I said, they were getting ready to ramp production, and they could go one of two directions. They could buy another ultrasonic welder and they could get another operator, or they could automate. So they chose to automate. So for total system cost, their total system cost for this automated system was $125,000. And so what we're actually going to do is they were going to have to buy a second welder. It was going to cost them $35,000. So to make that actual comparison for what they ended up with, we're going to take out that $35,000, and our total system cost then is going to be $90,000. Now, also along with that, obviously there's a cost of ownership associated with automation, and that's down here. This is the automated equipment annual operating cost. And if you look at note 2, it'll outline this, but for one robot, we usually figure $3,000 a year to operate that and $1,500 in maintenance. Obviously, if you have more than one robot in a system or any other really advanced mechanical device that you know it's either going to draw a certain amount of power, or there's a certain amount of maintenance or perishable parts associated with it, all that can be placed here. That kind of evens the scale. The idea in this tool isn't to try to sell automation. The idea in this tool is for you to get a realistic understanding of the difference between automating a process and doing that process manually. So at the top, in the green box there at the top, this is a value you don't always have. So we go in probably most of the time a lack of operators. Manpower is the biggest
Correct.
biggest
Labor
complaint we see.
shortages.
That's why most people are automating right now. But I can remember a time when it doesn't seem like it was as much that way, when people were really just trying to get more done quicker. So they were trying to increase their throughput. And that's what the green box is about, is if you know by automating a process, you're going to be able to increase your throughput, you can put a value there. Now, in this case, our customer shared with us that they did increase their throughput by automating. And because of that, they're making an additional $72,000 a year. I wouldn't have to put that in there. We could leave that blank. But in this case, we know what that is because they did increase their throughput. They've decreased their cycle time, and they're making more parts. So we'll fill that in there. The orange box there in the middle, on the left-hand side, you'll see a column that says manual process, and on the right-hand side, the automated process. This is where we put the labor cost in. So obviously here, for the manual process, we're going to have, in this case, there were 2 shifts per day, and there were going to be 2 employees on each shift because they're going to have an employee at each welder. So when we automated this process, they actually started running 3 shifts per day, and they're doing that with 1 operator per shift. The next row, this one I really like to pay attention to, because if you're taking a manual process and you're transferring some operators to higher value positions, if those employees all make roughly the same, your compensation doesn't change in these 2 areas. But if you're taking an area and you're transitioning operators out, but you're bringing in, say, a controls engineer or a highly skilled maintenance person, your employee total compensation may be a little bit higher with the automated process. That's something to pay attention to. In our example today, it was the same level of operator, and their operating costs in this facility were, or total compensation costs were $40,000 per year. The next row is human resources, and this is something, this value is for the most part with mid to large companies that we estimate it's about $3,000 per employee annually for your HR cost. Obviously, if you want to change this would be one of those areas. If you want to unprotect the sheet and change that value based on the metrics from your organization, you can do that. For some smaller companies, it may not be quite as high, but that's something you can kind of mess with there, play with, and see how the different results, how it affects the results. So this the last box down here with the orange labels, this is where we put in any additional known cost. And in our example today, we're not really going to fill in any of these, but what we run into sometimes is scenarios where in a manual process, they are tracking things well enough to realize they have a cost to scrap, but they have a cost to safety. This is where you would fill in something like the case I mentioned earlier, where the company that's working with glass has $10,000 a year in PPE costs. That would directly go under safety. And then the next column there, you put in a percentage of the cost savings when you automate that process. So obviously with safety, you're not buying safety glasses or masks or whatever it is that you're providing to your operators. You're not buying that anymore. So for the most part, that would go completely away. And the spreadsheet just adds that into the ROI calculation so you can figure that in. So let's take a look at the gold boxes and see where this leaves us. So for this customer, for this very case, they paid this off and started making additional profit in 9 months. Most of the companies we work with, it seems like we want a 1 to 1.5 year ROI, at the most 2, something like that.
Up to 2. Yeah.
So this company, obviously this was a great manual process to automate. They paid it off in 9 months, started making money, and then what's phenomenal is if you look at the cumulative cash flow there in the second table, at 5 years, they're at over $470,000 in additional cash flow. 10 years, they're over $1 million, and over 1.6 at 15 years. Now back off now so we can kind of see the table and the graph, and you can see this line indicates that cumulative cash flow. So this is kind of the ideal. This is what we love to see, because obviously it makes it a good choice for automation, and that's where we get involved and help you come up with a solution to help you become more profitable. To do a second example, I'm going to kind of just illustrate for you. If you're familiar with Excel, you know that you can copy a tab. We're going to create a copy, move it to the end, and we're going to do our second example here. If you rename this, just illustrate this, call this the shift example. The way the programming is set up, that'll bring it up at the top. You see it says shift example there. So I would recommend, if you have several different manual processes you're thinking about automating, set this one worksheet up with multiple tabs and go through this effort and see what makes sense to automate. The other thing you can do is if you've got multiple proposals, you can put the money in here and compare and just see where you come in at. So on this second example, one thing we see quite a bit, it seems like, is manufacturing facility will have a manual process that they're running 3 shifts. And if possible, they'd like to automate that process and take it down to 1 shift. So we're just going to walk through this, and I'm going to fill in new values here. We're going to call this a pretty expensive system. We're going to put it at $350,000. And our operating costs down here are about the same. We're going to put a robot in place. We're going to do some other things. We're not going to increase throughput, so we're not going to have any additional profit. At shifts per day, we're going to start out with manual at 3. Oops, wrong place. Let's do that. 3 shifts per day on the manual process. Employees on a shift, we're going to be at 2. And this facility pays a little better. They're at $45,000 for employee compensation. The automated process, we're going to drop down to 1 shift. And in this case, they're just going to have an operator feeding parts to this system. And they're going to be able to load it up and walk away. So we're going to say on an 8-hour shift, they're going to be about 1.6 hours we need an operator total. So we're going to call that 0.2. Again, compensation cost here is going to be the same. So we're at $45,000 there. We're not going to fill out this box at all. We don't have that information. So let's see what we've got. He's going to reach his ROI in 1 year and 3 months. But look at how much more money he's making for a process. Obviously, when you go from 3 shifts to 1 shift, one thing that you don't see on here, there's some additional cost. If you can turn off the lights in part of your plant, there's all kinds of costs associated with that are a little bit hard to get a quantitative value for, but you can kind of see where we're going here. The cumulative cash flow after 5 years is over 1 million. In 10 years, you're at 2.6. And if you're lucky enough to have that contract for 15 years, you made almost $4.4 million more than if you would have continued to do this in a manual fashion. So I think this kind of speaks for itself as far as the effectiveness of doing this. And again, I'll come over here and we'll back out and show the graph and the table. So I kind of look at this, and I guess where I arrive at is automation is going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when in manufacturing. And if you're in an industry that's fairly competitive, this is going to be one of the big things that makes a difference in your success, is whether or not you start looking at how and where you can automate. Look for that low-hanging fruit and start as soon as you can. So for now, I'm going to turn things over. We're going to go to Q&A here and see if you guys had any great questions.
All right, we have a couple questions here. So we'll start with this question here. It's so we got a question here. It says, in your experience, what type of projects typically have the best ROI? So, I mean, I would first off say, you know, one way to look at it is one with multiple operators for that application. I mean, that's one issue. Consistent part geometry
Makes a lot of difference.
You know, if your parts are not consistent, it's going to be more difficult to automate that process. So that's very crucial. Maybe an application with high volume, low mix is going to be a lot easier than, you know, your high mix, low volume type projects. So
for sure.
So hopefully that kind of helps as an answer. We have another one here as well. Let's see. Could you give me some examples of typical costs for automation systems? I think this can range for all applications, of course. You know, maybe for the simple one operator or one operator's doing that task, and what we're doing is you're moving that operator to another location because of labor shortages. So we're going to put a robot in its place and maybe add a few things. I would say it's going to range right around anywhere from 150 to that 250,000 mark, probably.
It just depend if you had different technologies that need to be brought to bear, that might drive your cost up.
Right. Kind of depends on the other equipment, the devices that you have to add. So, you know, there's one example. You could 200,000 to 400,000 is going to be probably more of the average ones that we see. People bringing to us and saying, hey, how can we automate this, or this is our idea, this is our FQ. I would say the range is that's more of an average range, 200,000 to 400,000 that we see. You can get up into that 800 to 2 million, you know, and there's another example that's going to be probably quite a few operators doing that process. Not always, but you're probably looking at, or, you know, more operators, of course, for that one. Here's another one we got here. It's if I gave all this information to an integrator, so what this is saying, and don't I run the risk of them using it just to justify a higher cost for their equipment?
I'll let me answer that.
So you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's one thing I've noticed over the years. It seems like a lot of times manufacturers hesitate to let an automation house know what their budget is for a project. And I understand that. I understand the concern and what's going on there. But the reality is cost is a part of engineering. And when we're trying to help a customer find the best solution, there's a lot of different directions we can go. And I'm not saying you need to tell us exactly what your budget is, but if you give an automation integrator some idea of what your budget is, or just tell us enough about the existing manual process that we can help you figure out your ROI, then we can customize that solution to your actual situation instead of just coming in with what's our best guess, I guess you could say. So,
right.
I would encourage anyone who's trying to get automation equipment built to really think about that. Got another question here. We are new to automation. How much time and money should we budget for operator training and post-installation support? I'll take a shot in the dark for that one.
Post-installation support. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's.
Kind of depends on the piece of equipment.
Yeah.
If you don't have automation equipment, like especially if you don't have an industrial robot and you're getting your first robots in, that question to me, the answer to that question changes dramatically. If you already have those things in place, the amount of time to get your operators up and running on a new piece of equipment that's just employing additional robots is entirely different than if you don't have that in place at all.
Correct, because now you got to take that up front for maybe training up one of your employees or an engineer to. But what, you know, as Force Design or maybe other integrators as well, we also provide that training for you during the installation process as part of the proposal, and so that helps out, I think, too. But yeah, so money-wise, I think it's going to range.
Yeah. And post-installation support is kind of the same way. It would depend on the complexity of what you're doing, and that is a part of it, though. You need to have people in place. That's why when we talk about comparing the annual compensation cost for employees for the manual process versus the automated process, you really need to stop and think about what type of employees you need to support that automation, because it may drive up that cost a little bit there. I think what you'll find in general, though, is because when we automate, we can do things so much quicker and with such repeatability. Overall, you'll still make your ROI, but to get an accurate ROI, it's a good idea to put the money in there for that post-installation support personnel that needs to happen.
Looks like we might have another question here.
Yeah.
Do you work with partners, or are you full turnkey concept to installation? We are full turnkey concept installation. So we're a turnkey automation house. So we can provide you the concept, with the proposal. We can do the design work, and the manufacturing and assembly is all in-house. And then we travel to do the full install and get you up and running in production. So
Yep. That's what we like, actually. That's our ideal project.
Yep.
All right. I'm gonna close this up.
It looks like that's about it.
So yeah, so
I got one more question actually just came in. It says, if I have a project I'm considering, at what point in the process should I do the ROI calculation?
good question.
So with that, we're both, I think, in agreement that the earlier the better.
Yep.
Not saying that after maybe some of the processes put together, the RFQs sent out, maybe you get some of your proposals back. Doing it then still is going to benefit you, and it's going to benefit your decision.
Yeah,
it's going to help you out. So
I would even say even a little further than that. One thing that I think a manufacturer could do with this ROI sheet is if you can provide some of this information that's asked for on this sheet to an integration house like Force, it gives us a much better idea of what kind of project that you need when we show up. We tend to always focus on the engineering side of it, what's required mechanically and electrically. But the truth of the matter is this matters to you too. So the more of that kind of information you can provide us that's asked for on the sheet, that goes a long way towards getting things